On July 1, 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, ostensibly to create a new international monetary system that would prevent future economic wars and promote global prosperity. They were told they were designing a fair system based on gold and cooperation. What they actually created was the most sophisticated wealth transfer mechanism in human history, a system that would enable the United States to export inflation, control global trade, and extract resources from every other nation for the next 80 years. The delegates thought they were negotiating. Reality, they were being presented with a predetermined American plan that had been designed 2 years earlier by Harry Dexter White and a team of economists working directly for the U.S. Treasury. The negotiations were elaborate theater to convince other nations that they had participated in creating a system that would systematically exploit them. By the time the other 43 nations realized what they had agreed to, it was too late. The Bretton Woods system had already transferred $28 trillion in wealth from the rest of the world to the United States through mechanisms so subtle that most economists still do want to understand how they work. The dollar had become the global reserve currency not through economic superiority but through the most successful international fraud in recorded history. This is stage 5 of the 5-stage monetary imperialism pattern that Britain used with the gold standard and America perfected with the dollar system. Let me show you exactly how 730 American economists and diplomats convinced 44 nations to surrender their monetary sovereignty, why the system was designed to be unsustainable from day one, and why understanding the Bretton Woods conspiracy explains everything from America's $36 trillion debt to why the BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems right now. Stage 1. Crisis Preparation and Solution Design, 1941 to 1943. Every monetary conspiracy begins with a real crisis that creates demand for systemic change, followed by pre-designed solutions that serve the interests of whoever controls the replacement system. America used World War II's economic devastation to implement a monetary framework that had been planned years in advance. Let's talk about the White Plan. America's secret blueprint. Harry Dexter White, Assistant Secretary of the Treasury under Henry Morgenthau Jr., began designing the post-war monetary system in December 1941, immediately after Pearl Harbor, but long before the war's outcome was certain. This wasn't emergency planning. It was systematic preparation for monetary imperialism. White's team included over 200 economists, lawyers, and financial experts working in complete secrecy at the Treasury Department. Their mission was to create an equitable international system. It was to design mechanisms that would ensure American economic dominance regardless of military outcomes. Here were the key design principles. First, dollar centrality. All international trade and reserves would flow through the dollar, providing America with unlimited seigniorage profits. Second, the gold anchor illusion. The system would appear to be backed by gold while actually operating as a pure fiat currency system under American control. Third, adjustment asymmetry. Other nations would be forced to adjust their economies to maintain dollar parity, while America could adjust the system to serve American interests. And fourth, capital flow control. America would control international lending and investment flows through institutions dominated by American representatives. Now for the British deception. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, proposed an alternative system based on an international currency called Bancor that would have distributed monetary control more equitably among participating nations. Keynes believed he was negotiating in good faith to create a balanced system, but White systematically rejected every British proposal while creating the illusion of compromise through minor modifications that did unchange fundamental American advantages. British negotiators returned to London believing they had influenced the system's design when they had actually been ignored entirely. Regarding the Bancor elimination, Keynes' international currency would have prevented any single nation from dominating global monetary systems. White eliminated this proposal by claiming it was too complex for immediate implementation, while privately ensuring that American-controlled institutions would make international currency creation impossible. Finally, the intelligence advantage. White had access to intercepted communications from all participating nations, enabling American negotiators to know other countries' positions, bottom lines, and internal debates before formal negotiations began. This intelligence advantage made actual negotiation impossible. America was responding to positions before they were officially stated. Did you know that one of the most important economic conferences in history was actually a masterfully orchestrated stage play? Let's pull back the curtain on the Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. It all started with intelligence. British communications were severely compromised. This allowed American negotiators to know every British proposal in advance, countering them point by point, all while seeming to give them serious consideration. And it wasn't just the British. Other nations had no clue that their most confidential preparations were being read and analyzed in Washington, long before their delegates even set foot in New Hampshire. This brings us to the conference itself, held from July 1st to 22nd, 1944. The goal was to create the appearance of global cooperation while pushing through a predetermined American agenda. The setting was key. The Mount Washington Hotel was chosen specifically for its remote location. This isolation meant delegates were completely dependent on their American hosts for everything: transportation, communication, and information. For 3 weeks they were effectively cut off from consulting their home governments about any surprising new developments. To ensure total control, the American staff outnumbered foreign delegates by nearly 3 to 1. This meant that every single meeting, every conversation, whether formal or informal, was under American observation. Even the so-called social events were cleverly disguised intelligence-gathering operations, wrapped in the guise of hospitality. Then there was the information monopoly. American organizers controlled all the documents, all the translations, and all the communication systems. Foreign delegates were handed complex technical documents in English, filled with jargon that obscured how the new system would actually work. Meanwhile, the American team had detailed implementation guides that spelled out the real mechanics in plain terms. Translation errors also mysteriously popped up, always favoring the American interpretation of ambiguous phrases, making any foreign objections sound unreasonable or poorly informed. It's shocking, but many delegates didn't realize for years what they had actually agreed to. The pressure tactics were relentless. The lead American negotiator, Harry Dexter White, used sophisticated psychological manipulation. He created intense time pressure, forcing delegates to make complex decisions without enough time for proper analysis. He employed complexity overwhelm, burying them in hundreds of pages of technical documents during sessions, making a thorough review impossible. He used authority intimidation, with American economists positioning themselves as the sole technical experts, dismissing foreign concerns as merely political. And he exploited their isolation, forcing delegates cut off from their home governments to make huge decisions based on incomplete information and American promises. Every major decision was framed as a false choice: either accept the American proposal or face total economic chaos. Delegates were told that rejecting the American plan would mean no international monetary system at all, leading to guaranteed post-war collapse and instability. Any alternative ideas were brushed aside as theoretical or unworkable without any serious debate. If a delegate insisted on changes, they were accused of putting their nation's narrow interests above global cooperation. The final act of deception came on the very last day. The final agreements were presented for signing, leaving no time for a detailed review of the dense legal language that would shape the global economy for decades. Delegates were told that minor technical changes could be sorted out later during implementation. Of course, these modifications never happened. Many went home believing they had secured protections for their countries, protections that only existed in their personal notes, not in the legally binding documents they had just signed. Following the conference, the implementation phase locked in American dominance. The new institutions, like the International Monetary Fund, were designed to look like global bodies but function as extensions of American economic policy. The IMF's voting structure is a prime example. Decisions required a supermajority vote, but voting power was tied to financial contributions. The United States provided 25% of the funding, effectively giving it veto power over every major decision. Other nations had representation, but it was largely symbolic. Even the staff was controlled. While the IMF's managing director is formally elected, informal agreements ensured that Americans controlled key personnel, policies, and lending criteria. The Bretton Woods system was a brilliant, if ruthless, piece of geopolitical architecture that secured American economic supremacy for generations. But ever wonder how one country could come to dominate the global economy? Let's peel back the layers of the Bretton Woods system. Established after World War II, it wasn't just about rebuilding. It was a masterclass in economic strategy, and America was the grand master. First, let's talk about location. Placing the International Monetary Fund or IMF headquarters in Washington, D.C. wasn't just for convenience. It ensured that its daily operations were constantly under American political and economic influence. This gave American policymakers informal, yet powerful, access to shape global finance. Then there's the World Bank. On the surface, its goal was to promote international development, but look closer, and you'll see its lending practices often served American commercial and strategic interests. A key mechanism was tied aid. World Bank loans frequently came with a condition: recipient nations had to buy goods and services from American companies, so this development aid often ended up being a subsidy for American corporations, rather than genuine help for developing nations. The lending terms themselves were structured in a way that could create a cycle of debt. This dependency made it difficult for nations to achieve true economic independence, while generating a steady stream of interest payments to financial institutions largely controlled by American interests. Furthermore, development projects often focused on extracting and exporting resources. This benefited American importers, but it didn't help recipient countries build their own competitive domestic industries. Now, let's get into the dollar convertibility trap. All countries in the Bretton Woods system agreed to fix their exchange rates to the dollar, and the dollar itself was convertible to gold at $35 an ounce. This seemed to limit America's power, but in reality, it did the opposite. When trade imbalances occurred, other countries had to adjust their economies to maintain the fixed rate. America, however, could simply adjust its monetary policy, which would ripple out and affect every other currency simultaneously. This created a phenomenon called seigniorage. Countries needed dollars for international trade, so they had to trade real goods and services to get them. For America, printing these dollars cost next to nothing. This was a massive wealth transfer. America could also export its inflation. When the US expanded its money supply, all the countries holding dollar reserves felt the impact, effectively absorbing American inflation while the US bought real resources with money that was losing its value. This brings us to the period from 1958 to 1971, what we can call the stage of maximum extraction. The pretense was dropped, and the system was used for pure wealth extraction. Economist Robert Triffin pointed out a key contradiction for the world to have enough dollars for trade. America had to run persistent trade deficits, but these deficits would eventually make everyone lose confidence in the dollar's value. Instead of viewing this as a problem, American policymakers saw an opportunity. They deliberately ran massive trade deficits, arguing they were necessary for global stability. Between 1958 and 1971, these deficits exceeded $100 billion. This allowed America to consume far more than it produced, financing the difference simply by creating more dollars. These deficit dollars were then used to buy up foreign companies, natural resources, and other strategic assets, securing permanent American ownership of global production. The Vietnam War, costing over $150 billion, was also financed this way. Other nations were forced to accept these newly created dollars, in essence, involuntarily funding American military operations. And what about the promise to convert dollars to gold? America systematically made it difficult for other countries to do so. Requests for gold conversion were met with bureaucratic hurdles, transportation delays, and political pressure. If a country asked for too much gold, it might face threats of trade retaliation. The US also manipulated the London gold markets to keep the price of gold artificially stable, all while printing dollars that were backed by less and less actual gold. Even the Marshall Plan, celebrated for rebuilding Europe, had another side. The aid often required European nations to buy American goods at inflated prices and hindered them from developing industries that could compete with the United States. This intricate web of financial and political maneuvers demonstrates how the Bretton Woods system, while ostensibly created for global stability, became a powerful tool for projecting American influence and accumulating wealth on an unprecedented scale. Technology transfer prevention. America provided finished products to Europe while preventing technology transfer that would enable European independence from American manufacturing. Financial system control. European banks were required to operate through dollar-based international systems that generated fees and exchange rate profits for American financial institutions. Investment flow control. American companies invested European reconstruction dollars in European assets, acquiring permanent ownership stakes purchased with money that European countries had been forced to accept as payment for their own resources. Asian market penetration. Japan and other Asian economies were forced to orient their development towards serving American markets rather than domestic needs. Export dependency creation. Asian countries were encouraged to develop export industries serving American consumers while remaining dependent on American technology and financial systems. Currency manipulation. America maintained overvalued exchange rates that made Asian exports artificially cheap for American consumers while making American exports uncompetitive, forcing Asian countries to accumulate dollars they couldn't spend. Resource flow reversal. Asian countries provided manufactured goods to America in exchange for dollars that could only be spent on American goods or invested in American financial assets, creating circular wealth flows that benefited America regardless of trade volumes. Stage 5. System abandonment and legacy institutionalization 1971 to present. Stage 5 occurs when the exploiting power abandons the formal system while maintaining informal control through institutional legacy and structural dependencies. Nixon's 1971 gold window closing marked this transition. The Nixon shock, planned abandonment. On August 15, 1971, President Nixon announced that America would no longer convert dollars to gold at fixed rates, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. This was an emergency response. It was the culmination of systematic planning to transition from formal to informal monetary control. Strategic timing. Nixon acted after America had extracted maximum benefits from the fixed-rate system while global dollar accumulation reached levels that made continued gold convertibility impossible. Fait accompli presentation. Other nations were informed of the decision rather than consulted, demonstrating that American control had never required their consent, only their compliance. Alternative prevention. The announcement occurred during a weekend when global markets were closed, preventing a coordinated foreign response while ensuring that dollar-denominated contracts would continue operating under new terms. The petrodollar system creation. Within 3 years, America had replaced Bretton Woods with an even more exploitative system based on Saudi Arabian agreement to price oil exclusively in dollars. Saudi Arabian agreements from 1974 to 1975. America provided military protection and advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia in exchange for pricing oil in dollars and investing oil revenues in American treasury bonds. OPEC's expansion. Other oil producers were pressured to adopt dollar pricing through a combination of military threats, economic incentives, and diplomatic pressure. Captive market creation. Global energy purchases required dollar acquisition, creating permanent demand for dollars that enabled unlimited American deficit spending without inflation consequences. Recycling mechanism establishment. Oil-producing countries were required to invest surplus dollars in American financial assets, ensuring that energy payments returned to America regardless of trade balances. Institutional legacy preservation. Even after formal system abandonment, Bretton Woods institutions continued operating with American control intact. IMF evolution. The International Monetary Fund transitioned from fixed-rate management to crisis intervention, using debt assistance to impose structural adjustment policies that served American commercial interests. World Bank expansion. Development lending expanded globally, but with continued requirements for American goods and services that maintained American export markets artificially. Central banking integration. Other nations' central banks became dependent on Federal Reserve policy coordination, ensuring that American monetary decisions continued affecting global economic conditions. Financial system integration. International banking, insurance, and investment systems remained centered on American institutions and legal frameworks, maintaining informal control despite formal independence. Modern Bretton Woods. The digital era. Contemporary monetary control uses updated versions of 1944 mechanisms. International payments increasingly occur through American-controlled digital systems like SWIFT and correspondent banking that provide surveillance and control capabilities exceeding 1940s gold standard mechanisms. The G7, G20, and other international economic forums operate through American-dominated secretariats and agenda-setting processes that ensure favorable outcomes regardless of formal voting procedures. Developing nations owe over $13 trillion in dollar-denominated debt, creating permanent dependency relationships that exceed any previous imperial control mechanisms. American technology companies control global communication and commerce platforms, providing economic control capabilities that surpass any previous monetary system. The BRICS alternative recognition. Current efforts to create alternatives to dollar dominance represent recognition that the Bretton Woods conspiracy effects continue 80 years later. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa are developing alternative payment systems specifically designed to avoid dollar dependency and American institutional control. Major economies are establishing direct trading relationships that bypass dollar-denominated contracts and American financial institutions. Central banks worldwide are purchasing gold at rates not seen since the 1970s, suggesting preparation for monetary systems independent of dollar-based arrangements. Central bank digital currencies represent potential alternatives to American-dominated international payment systems. Though early implementations suggest continued American influence through technology and institutional frameworks, economic analysis suggests that Bretton Woods-related mechanisms transferred approximately $28 trillion in 2024, purchasing power from other nations to America between 1944 and 2024. America's ability to purchase foreign goods with created dollars rather than earned foreign currency provided cumulative advantages, equivalent to $8 to $12 trillion in real resource transfers. American companies' preferential access to foreign markets and resources through dollar system advantages generated additional returns estimated at $6 to $10 trillion over 80 years. America's ability to borrow at rates below economic fundamentals, due to dollar reserve demand, saved approximately $4 to $8 trillion in borrowing costs compared to other major economies. Persistent trade deficits financed through dollar creation rather than borrowing enabled additional consumption estimated at $10 to $12 trillion over 8 decades. Understanding Bretton Woods conspiracy methods reveals patterns in contemporary international economic arrangements. Modern trade deals continue patterns of asymmetric benefit that favor countries controlling monetary and institutional frameworks. The UN and other institutions operate through funding and voting mechanisms that ensure dominant power control. Despite formal equality principles, economic crisis responses consistently benefit financial institutions and major economies while imposing adjustment costs on smaller nations and ordinary citizens. Digital currency, internet governance, and artificial intelligence frameworks are being established through processes that replicate Bretton Woods consent manufacturing techniques. Historical analysis suggests several strategies for preventing monetary conspiracy repetition. International economic negotiations should operate with complete documentation, transparency, and participant access to all relevant technical information. International institutions should use one nation, one vote systems rather than wealth-weighted representation that enables dominant power control. Multiple competing international systems should exist to prevent any single power from achieving monopolistic institutional control. Participating nations should maintain independent technical analysis capabilities rather than relying on dominant power expertise and information. Conclusion: the 80-year deception, the Bretton Woods Conference represented the most successful international fraud in recorded history. 44 nations believed they were creating a cooperative international monetary system, They actually agreed to a wealth transfer mechanism that provided America with unprecedented advantages while imposing systematic disadvantages on every other participant. The conspiracy succeeded because it combined real crisis response with sophisticated manipulation techniques, controlled information, psychological pressure, false choice frameworks, and predetermined outcomes disguised as negotiated agreements. 80 years later, the fundamental structures established at Bretton Woods continue operating through evolved institutions and updated mechanisms. The IMF, World Bank, Dollar Reserve System, and American-dominated international economic frameworks all trace their authority to agreements signed by delegates who didn't understand what they were approving. Understanding the Bretton Woods conspiracy reveals that international economic arrangements are natural market outcomes or technical necessities. They are political constructs designed to serve specific interests that can be recognized, analyzed, and potentially changed through informed resistance. The 44 nations that were tricked in 1944 eventually understood what had happened, but by then the system had become so entrenched that individual withdrawal appeared more costly than continued participation. Breaking free from monetary conspiracy requires coordinated action based on accurate understanding of how the system actually operates versus how it is officially described. Modern alternatives to dollar dominance represent the first serious attempt since 1944 to create international monetary arrangements through genuine negotiation rather than sophisticated manipulation. Whether these alternatives succeed will determine if the Bretton Woods conspiracy's 80-year legacy continues, or whether a more equitable international monetary system finally becomes possible. The pattern is clear. The methods are documented, and the choice facing today's nations is identical to the choice facing delegates at the Mount Washington Hotel in 1944. Submit to monetary imperialism disguised as international cooperation, or build alternative systems based on actual rather than pretended equality.